Colony at peak strength, frames dense with capped brood, nectar arriving in steady streams, bees packed across every available surface. The beekeeper looks in, sees the congestion, and makes what seems like the obvious decision: it is time to add the second super. The hive is full. Space must be the limiting factor. Giving more room should accelerate the build. In many apiaries, however, the result does not match that reasoning. The second super sits largely empty for weeks. Foragers continue working, but the honey yield at season's end comes in lower than it should. The colony never quite expanded the way the beekeeper expected. Have you experienced this in your own hives? If this kind of biology-based analysis is what brings you here, a like helps this content reach beekeepers who are asking the same questions. The frustrating part is that nothing appears wrong at the time. The colony is healthy. The queen is laying well. Foragers are returning with full corbiculae. From the outside, every signal points to a colony that should be thriving. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this: a colony does not expand into space simply because that space exists. Expansion is a biological decision governed by internal signals that can be disrupted when the spatial environment changes faster than the colony's population density can compensate for. This is the core. The historical record on this point is clearer than many modern beekeepers realize. Lorenzo Lorraine Langstroth, whose work in the 1850s established the foundational principles of modern hive management, wrote extensively about the relationship between population density and productive colony behavior. His observation was not simply that bees needed space, it was that bees needed the right amount of space at the right time, matched to their current population capacity. Langstroth was precise on this point in ways that are often lost in modern summaries of his work. He was not advocating for perpetual expansion. He was describing a calibrated relationship between hive volume and the biological state of the colony occupying it. Moses Quinby, whose Practical Beekeeping Manual of 1865 remained a standard reference in American apiculture for decades, cautioned explicitly against what he described as giving too much room too soon. Quinby's concern was rooted in direct observation across large commercial-scale apiaries. Colonies given excess space early in the season frequently failed to fill combs at the rate that well-managed, tightly populated colonies did. He attributed this to a diffusion of colony energy, labor dispersed across too much unoccupied comb rather than concentrated in a compact, efficiently managed space. Charles Dadant and A.I. Root, writing through the latter half of the 19th century and into the early 20th, echoed these observations with increasing specificity. Root's ABC and XYZ of Bee Culture, which went through multiple editions from 1877 onward and remained a foundational reference across generations of American beekeepers, included repeated attention to the danger of premature spatial expansion. The language these men used was practical and empirical, drawn from seasons of watching how colonies actually performed under varying space conditions, but the biological mechanisms underlying their caution can now be examined with considerably more precision. Here is what is actually happening inside the hive when a second super is added before the colony is ready to occupy it. A functioning colony maintains its internal environment through a combination of thermoregulation, pheromone signaling, and the spatial distribution of its workforce. These three systems are deeply interrelated, and all three are affected when the colony's occupied volume increases faster than its population can support. Begin with temperature. Bees maintain the brood nest at a remarkably stable range of approximately 93 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The honey super above the brood nest is not held at brood nest temperature, but it is not thermally neutral either. Worker bees in the super must maintain adequate warmth to support the continuous evaporation of nectar into honey. Nectar arrives from the field with a water content of roughly 60 to 80%. Finished honey contains approximately 18% water or less. Moving from one state to the other requires sustained heat, active airflow management, and a sufficiently dense population of house bees committed to that space over an extended period. When a second super is added before the first is substantially filled and well populated, the colony's house bee force, already committed to brood care, nectar processing, and comb construction in the first super, is now distributed across a significantly larger volume. Temperature gradients in the upper boxes become less stable. Nectar evaporation slows. Comb construction in the new super stalls because there are not enough wax-producing bees in the right location to sustain it efficiently. Strong colony. Diluted workforce. This is the mechanism that Langstroth and Quinby were observing empirically, without the benefit of modern biological terminology. The colony was not underperforming because of the weather, or the forage, or the queen. It was underperforming because the space management was ahead of its biological capacity to occupy that space. And here is where the timing pressure becomes real. A nectar flow does not wait. The window during which a colony can convert arriving nectar into surplus honey above and beyond what the colony itself consumes is frequently measured in weeks rather than months. In much of the northeastern and midwestern United States, where white clover, Alsik clover, and basswood represent the primary surplus nectar sources, the productive flow period may run 4 to 6 weeks at most. Premature super addition during that window is not a neutral decision. It can reduce the effective output of a colony during precisely the period when productive capacity matters most. Now consider the role of pheromone concentration. A bee colony coordinates its behavior through a complex and overlapping system of chemical signals. Among the most relevant to honey production is Nasonov pheromone, released by worker bees at hive entrances and at newly occupied comb, to orient foragers and concentrate collective activity in productive areas. Queen mandibular pheromone, distributed throughout the colony by worker contact and trophallaxis, plays a central role in maintaining colony cohesion and influencing the behavioral state of workers across the hive. Together, these chemical gradients create a coherent spatial picture for every bee within the colony, a continuous signal environment that tells workers where activity is concentrated, where comb is being built, where nectar is being processed. In a compact, well-occupied hive, these pheromone gradients are dense and consistent. Workers moving through the hive receive clear chemical information about where to direct their labor. The colony behaves as a coordinated biological unit with strong spatial awareness. When a second super is added, particularly if it is placed above a partially filled first super, the total hive volume increases significantly. The same number of pheromone-producing bees are now distributed across a larger space. Signal density decreases. The behavioral cues that orient workers toward new comb construction and active nectar processing become less consistent, less reinforcing. Workers entering the new super encounter a chemical environment that does not yet carry the signals of productive established activity. This is not a catastrophic failure. The colony does not collapse. Foragers continue returning. The queen continues laying. But the efficiency of coordinated labor, the precision with which the colony directs its workforce toward the highest value tasks during a finite flow period, is reduced in ways that accumulate over days and weeks. If you value biology-based beekeeping, consider subscribing. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this: the consequences of premature super addition are not visible at the time the decision is made. When the second super is placed, the colony still looks strong. Nothing appears wrong for 2 weeks, sometimes 3. By the time the reduced honey yield becomes apparent at extraction, the nectar flow may be ending, and the decision that shaped that outcome is a month in the past and difficult to trace. This is why beekeepers who managed large commercial apiaries in the 19th century, men who were comparing output across dozens of colonies across multiple consecutive seasons, were positioned to observe the pattern in ways that a small-scale beekeeper managing a handful of hives for the first season simply could not be. The signal exists in the aggregate. In a single hive, a reduced yield is easy to attribute to the weather, or to forage variation, or to the individual character of that particular colony. Quinby understood this. Root understood this. Their caution about premature space addition was not theoretical. It was drawn from the kind of multi-season, multi-colony observation that forces a beekeeper to look past individual variation and into structural causes. There is a second layer to this that is often overlooked entirely. The placement of the second super matters as much as the timing of it. In 19th century American practice, there was genuine debate about whether a second super should be placed above the first, or between the first super and the brood nest. The technique, sometimes referred to as bottom supering, placing the new super directly above the brood nest, below the partially filled super, was argued by some practitioners to produce better results precisely because of the biological principles described above. Bees naturally work upward from the brood nest. The brood cluster is where population density is highest, where behavioral energy is most concentrated, and where the impulse to expand territory is strongest. When a new empty super is placed at the top of the stack, above a partially filled super, the colony must pass through the established worked super to reach the new space. Depending on how fully capped the first super is, this can create a behavioral barrier. Bees may not consistently extend their working territory into the upper box until the lower one is more thoroughly completed. Bottom supering addresses this by positioning new drawn comb directly adjacent to the brood cluster. The colony extends its working territory upward into the new space naturally, because that space is spatially and thermally contiguous with the cluster. The pheromone gradient extends upward more continuously. House bees move into the new space as a natural progression of the brood nest expansion they are already managing. Root discussed this technique in detail across multiple editions of his work. Langstroth's successors debated it in the agricultural press of the 1870s. The practical consensus that emerged was not absolute. Both approaches can produce results in the right conditions, but the biological reasoning behind bottom supering reflects a clear understanding of how colonies actually move through space and respond to it. What does this mean in practice? The threshold that appears most consistently in the historical literature, and that aligns with the biological reasoning described here, is this. A second super should not be added until approximately 7 of 10 frames in the first super are drawn, populated, and being actively worked. That means nectar is present in open cells, bees are present across the majority of the frame surface, and comb construction is either complete or in late stages. 7 of 10 is not an arbitrary number. It represents a population density sufficient to maintain the thermal environment of the super, sustain pheromone signal concentration at a functional level, and continue comb production without the dilution effects described above. Below that threshold, the colony is still concentrating its productive labor in the lower super. Adding new space above it does not accelerate that work, it draws resources away from it. The timing within the nectar flow matters with equal weight. In regions where the primary flow runs from late May through mid-July, clover, basswood, tulip poplar, super addition, decisions made in the first 2 weeks of June are among the most consequential a beekeeper will make that season. An addition made 1 week too early during a short, intense flow can cost the colony productive days that cannot be recovered. Temperature is a third variable that is often underweighted. Adding significant new comb space above the cluster during a cold spell, even during the nominal flow period, creates thermal challenges the colony may not manage efficiently. Below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the house bee population faces increased demands just maintaining the existing brood nest and first super. New space introduced under those conditions is unlikely to be colonized quickly. Wait for a stretch of consistently warm weather before adding a second super, and inspect the existing super carefully first. Count the worked frames. Do not make the decision based on entrance traffic or external appearance alone. The window to get this right is not forgiving. In an apiary where the primary nectar source blooms for 3 to 4 weeks, a misplaced super added 1 week too early can reduce effective working time by a meaningful fraction of that already short window. The colony spends that time in thermal and chemical reorganization rather than storage. Several patterns appear repeatedly, both in the historical literature and in modern observation, and they are worth naming precisely. The first is entrance congestion, misread as readiness. When bees are clustering heavily at the entrance, fanning with visible intensity and appearing to overflow the hive, the instinct is to add space immediately, but heavy fanning and entrance clustering during a flow frequently indicate active nectar ripening, a sign that the colony is managing humidity inside a nearly full super rather than a sign that the colony has run out of room and is prepared to expand. Inspect the frames, count the worked surfaces. Do not let entrance behavior alone drive the supering decision. The second pattern is the addition of undrawn foundation into the second super. Foundation, whether fresh beeswax or unwaxed plastic, requires significant energy investment from the colony before it can be used for storage. Producing the wax to draw comb requires young worker bees to consume a substantial amount of honey for each pound of wax secreted. Adding undrawn foundation to an adequately working first super asks the colony to simultaneously commit resources to construction and to storage at a moment when the nectar flow is demanding maximum attention to the latter. Where drawn comb is available from previous seasons, use it for super expansion. If drawn comb is unavailable, recognize that the colony will take longer to populate the new super and factor that delay into timing expectations. The third pattern is the addition of supers during a nectar dearth. A dearth, a period when little or no nectar is available from available forage, fundamentally alters colony behavioral state. Foragers reduce their activity. House bee attention shifts. Adding new space during a dearth accomplishes nothing productive, creates open, unguarded comb that can attract robbing behavior, and introduces maintenance demands at a moment when the colony's energy is already reduced. Supering decisions belong to active flow periods. If a dearth arrives before the first super is fully worked, hold the second super until conditions improve. When super addition is timed correctly, when 7 or more frames in the first super are drawn and actively worked before the second is placed, the behavioral outcome is consistent and predictable. The colony extends its working territory upward in an orderly progression. Foragers continue converting, arriving nectar into capped honey in the lower super while beginning the construction and filling process in the upper one. House bees maintain adequate thermal conditions across both spaces because the population density relative to total hive volume is sufficient to support that work. Pheromone signaling remains coherent and reinforcing. The colony's coordinated labor does not dilute across unmanageable space. The result is not a dramatic transformation in yield. It is a stabilization of the colony's productive potential, a prevention of the avoidable loss that occurs when space management outpaces biological capacity. The colony performs closer to what its forager population and the available nectar flow together make possible across the full duration of that flow. This is what the 19th century practitioners were measuring. Not a special technique, not a guaranteed multiplier, a management decision, aligned with how the colony actually operates, made at the moment the colony's biology is prepared for it. The bees working a Langstroth hive today are not fundamentally different from the bees Quinby and Root managed in the 1870s. The biology has not changed. The nectar flows are shorter in many regions now than they were in the diversified agricultural landscapes of that era, which makes the margin for timing errors smaller, not larger. The consequences of misaligned space management are, if anything, more significant in modern apiaries than they were when clover and basswood grew across thousands of unbroken acres. Understanding why premature superaddition slows a colony, rather than simply knowing that it does, is the difference between applying a rule and managing a living biological system. The colony signals its readiness in the frames. 7 drawn, actively worked frames in the first super, a consistent nectar flow underway, warm, stable temperatures sustained over days, not hours. These are the conditions under which adding the second super aligns with the colony's actual biological state, rather than ahead of it. Give the colony the space it needs, precisely when it needs it. If this breakdown was useful, leave a comment with your experience. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping insights.